The first night I heard knocking outside my cabin after Alse Young was executed, I thought it was another settler needing help in the dark, until I opened the door and found footprints in the mud leading up to the porch, with no tracks leaving it. You're listening to True Haunting Log, where we share real haunted incidents from real people around the globe, and if you've experienced something you can't explain, send your story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com. Story 1. The Woman Outside. This happened in the Connecticut colony in the mid-1600s, long before people started writing ghost stories for entertainment, back when fear ruled entire settlements because survival itself already felt uncertain every day. I was 19 then, working night watch around the small settlement near Windsor, mostly checking livestock pens, watching for fires, and making sure nobody wandered too close to the woods after dark. People today don't fully understand how isolated those settlements really were. Once night fell, the world outside the cabins became almost completely black except for candlelight leaking through windows and whatever moonlight managed to reach the dirt paths between homes. The forest surrounding the settlement felt endless, thick enough to swallow sound, and after sundown most people stayed inside unless they absolutely had to leave. Before Alse Young's execution, the colony already felt tense for months. Livestock sickness had spread through nearby farms, children were dying from fever, crops were failing unpredictably, and people needed something to blame because fear without explanation becomes unbearable after long enough. That was how the accusation started, quietly at first, then everywhere. Some claimed Alse spoke strangely near church gatherings, others said animals became agitated when she passed them on the road. One man swore his daughter woke screaming after seeing a woman standing near their property late at night. None of it sounded convincing to me even then, but once enough people repeat fear to each other, doubt stops mattering. The settlement needed certainty more than truth. I remember the day they executed her because almost the entire town gathered to watch, despite pretending otherwise afterward. Nobody spoke much during it. People just stood quietly while the wind moved through the trees surrounding the clearing. What stayed with me most wasn't anger or shouting. It was the expression on her face. She looked confused, more than afraid, like she couldn't fully understand how everything had escalated that far. Afterward, the settlement changed almost immediately. Not dramatically at first, subtly. People started locking doors earlier than usual. Conversations stopped when someone approached. Livestock refused to settle at night, and several families claimed they heard footsteps moving between cabins long after everyone should have been asleep. The first strange thing I personally witnessed happened 3 nights after the execution while I was making rounds near the outer homes close to the tree line. Around midnight, I noticed one of the goats inside a pen near the edge of the settlement, behaving strangely, backing itself tightly against the fence while staring toward the woods without making a sound. Animals usually reacted loudly to predators back then, but this thing looked frozen instead. I raised my lantern and followed its line of sight toward the trees. At first, I saw nothing except darkness between branches. Then movement. Someone standing partially behind one of the trunks near the edge of the woods. A woman. She wasn't moving toward the settlement. She was just watching it. The distance and darkness kept me from seeing her face clearly, but I remember noticing her clothing immediately because it looked pale beneath the lantern glow, almost gray against the trees. "Who's there?" I called out loudly. The figure disappeared behind the trunk for a second, then slowly stepped out again several feet closer than before. No sound came from the movement, no branches shifting, no leaves disturbed beneath her feet, just suddenly nearer than she should have been. My chest tightened immediately. I started walking toward the fence line cautiously, lantern raised higher now, and the moment I took 3 steps forward, every dog in the settlement started barking at once behind me. I turned instinctively toward the noise for maybe 2 seconds. When I looked back toward the woods again, the woman was gone. I told myself the figure near the woods had been another settler at first, because admitting anything else in a place already poisoned by fear would have been dangerous. But deep down I knew something about what I saw didn't move like a normal person. The dogs kept barking long after the woman disappeared, straining against ropes and fences while staring toward the tree line with the same terrified focus the goat had shown earlier. I remember trying to calm myself by checking the nearby cabins afterward, convincing myself there had to be a practical explanation. Maybe someone wandering after curfew or trying to frighten people intentionally, but every home I visited that night felt wrong in the same quiet way. Nobody wanted to open their doors fully. Nobody wanted to speak outside, and more than once I caught people glancing toward the woods while pretending not to. Near the center of the settlement, I stopped at the home of a man named Caleb, whose wife had recently become sick. He opened the door only slightly when I knocked, candlelight barely illuminating part of his face, and before I could even mention what I'd seen, he asked me a question in a low voice. "Did you hear knocking yet?" The way he said it unsettled me immediately because it sounded less like curiosity and more like expectation. I asked him what he meant, and he hesitated long enough that I thought he might not answer at all. Then, quietly, he said, "Someone walks the cabins after midnight now." I tried dismissing it as panic spreading through town, but Caleb looked exhausted in a way fear alone doesn't create. He explained that for the past 2 nights, someone had knocked on his front door shortly before dawn. Not loud, not violent, just 3 slow knocks spaced evenly apart. Every time he checked outside afterward, nobody was there. Could have been children, I suggested weakly, though even saying it felt unconvincing. Caleb shook his head immediately. The footprints stop at the door. A cold pressure moved through my chest, hearing that because I still hadn't told him about the tracks I'd seen near my own cabin the night before. I had returned home near sunrise after patrol and found fresh mud prints leading directly to my porch. Bare human footprints, small, narrow, and exactly like Caleb described, they ended at the door, without returning anywhere. I didn't sleep much after that conversation. The settlement already felt tense before the execution, but now something worse had settled over the town. Not open panic yet, more like everyone was quietly waiting for another bad thing to happen. Even church gatherings became strange after sunset. People spoke softer, children stayed close to parents, and several families stopped traveling between homes once darkness fell. 3 nights later, the knocking finally came to my cabin. I woke sometime after midnight because I heard movement outside first, slow footsteps crossing the mud near the porch, not pacing, approaching. Then silence settled outside my door for several seconds before the knocking started. 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced, calm. My entire body went rigid listening to it because something about the sound felt deliberate in a way normal knocking never does. Whoever stood outside wasn't asking for help. They already knew I was awake. I grabbed the lantern beside my bed and sat there staring toward the door without moving. The knocking didn't repeat immediately. Instead, I heard something else. Breathing. Soft, uneven. Close enough that whoever stood outside seemed only inches from the wood. My chest tightened painfully because every instinct told me not to open that door. But another part of me couldn't stop thinking about the execution clearing and the expression on Alse Young's face before they killed her. Then a woman's voice spoke quietly from the other side of the cabin door. They still blame me. I froze completely because I recognized the voice instantly. I had only heard her speak once before the execution, but the sound stayed with me afterward. Calm, soft, tired. The breathing outside continued for several seconds after that. Then the voice whispered something that made my stomach turn cold. They'll need someone else soon. I didn't open the door that night, but I also didn't sleep again before sunrise because once the voice outside stopped speaking, the silence became worse than the knocking itself. I sat there with the lantern in my hands, listening to the darkness beyond the cabin walls, while soft wind moved through the settlement outside. And every few minutes I thought I heard footsteps circling slowly around the house before stopping again near the windows. When morning finally came, I forced myself outside expecting to find nothing, hoping exhaustion and fear had distorted what I heard, but the footprints were there exactly where I feared they would be. fresh mud prints leading across the ground directly to my door. Bare feet, small, narrow, and just like before, no tracks leading away. The sight unsettled me badly enough that I covered them before neighbors woke. Not because I thought people wouldn't believe me, but because I knew they would. That was the real danger in the settlement now. Fear no longer needed proof to spread. Over the next week, things grew worse across the colony in small ways that became impossible to ignore once added together. Livestock refused to settle at night near the outer homes. Children woke, screaming about the woman near the trees. One elderly man claimed he saw someone standing beside the old execution clearing shortly before dawn, even though nobody else was there when he approached, and almost every family near the edge of town started hearing the knocking. 3 slow knocks sometime after midnight, followed by silence outside the door. Nobody admitted opening their doors afterward, but rumors spread anyway. One woman swore she heard crying outside her cabin until sunrise. Another claimed she saw someone standing motionless beside her barn before disappearing into the fog near the woods. The settlement stopped feeling like a community after dark. It started feeling like people hiding separately from the same thing. I tried convincing myself there had to be a human explanation, maybe hysteria spreading after the execution, maybe people imagining sounds because guilt had poisoned the town, but that belief became harder to hold on to after what happened during my next night patrol. I was checking the outer edge of the settlement near the woods when I noticed lantern light moving between the trees ahead. At first I thought another watchman had wandered too far beyond the homes, but the light moved strangely, gliding between trunks too smoothly without the uneven motion a carried lantern normally makes. I raised my own lantern higher and called out, but the light deeper in the woods immediately stopped moving. Then, slowly, it began moving toward me. My pulse tightened hard enough to hurt because no footsteps accompanied it, no branches shifted, just pale lantern glow drifting silently through the darkness between the trees. I remember backing away instinctively toward the nearest fence line while trying to keep the light in view, and as it came closer, I finally realized there wasn't actually a lantern at all. The glow came from the woman herself, faint, weak, like moonlight reflecting through fog. She stepped out from the trees maybe 30 feet away, and for the first time I saw her face clearly enough to remove all doubt. It was Alse Young, or something wearing her memory. Her expression looked exactly as it had the day of the execution. Not angry, not monstrous, just deeply tired. "You heard me," she said softly. My throat tightened so badly I couldn't answer immediately. Every instinct told me to run back toward the settlement, but something about her presence held me still. The fear surrounding her felt wrong somehow, less like danger and more like grief, stretched too far. "What do you want?" I finally asked. She looked past me toward the settlement lights behind the cabins. "They're listening for me now," she whispered. "That's how it spreads." Before I could ask what she meant, a scream erupted somewhere deeper in town, a woman screaming loud enough to echo across the settlement. Alse looked toward the sound immediately, then slowly back at me, and for the first time since seeing her, real fear appeared in her face. "They chose another one." The moment she said they chose another one, every part of me went cold, because I understood immediately what she meant, and somewhere deeper in the settlement, the screaming continued, joined now by shouting voices and doors opening across the colony. I turned instinctively toward town for only a second, but when I looked back toward the tree line again, Alse Young was gone. No footsteps, no movement through branches, just empty darkness between the trees where she had been standing moments earlier. I ran toward the settlement after that, lanterns swinging hard enough to throw uneven light across the muddy paths between cabins, while more people emerged from their homes, carrying candles and rifles. The screaming was coming from the northern side of town near the Miller family property, and by the time I reached the area, half the settlement had already gathered outside. A young woman named Ruth Miller was on the ground near the porch, shaking violently, while several people tried restraining her. Others stood further back, whispering prayers under their breath, while staring toward the woods beyond the house. I remember noticing the fear in everyone's faces immediately because it wasn't concern anymore. It was recognition, the kind of fear people carry when they think they're witnessing proof of something they already secretly believed. Ruth kept repeating the same sentence over and over between sobs. She was outside the window, low. Some people started crying after hearing that. Others demanded the minister be brought immediately. And standing there watching the panic spread through the crowd, I realized something horrifying about the settlement. Nobody wanted the fear to stop anymore. They needed it. The colony had become so consumed by guilt and suspicion that terror itself was now holding the town together. I pushed through the crowd trying to calm people down, but nobody listened. Several men were already talking about searching the woods before sunrise. Others whispered about more witches hiding among the settlement. One woman pointed toward the darkness near the trees and claimed she saw movement standing between the trunks, watching the homes. Then the knocking started again. Not at one cabin. Everywhere. 3 slow knocks echoing across different homes throughout the settlement, almost simultaneously. The sound spread through the colony in uneven patterns while people froze in place listening. One cabin near the church, another near the outer homes, then another somewhere behind us. Calm, deliberate. The crowd began panicking completely after that. Some ran inside their homes, others started praying openly in the mud. A few men raised rifles toward the woods, even though nothing visible stood there. And underneath all the chaos, I noticed something worse. The knocking was moving closer together. Like whatever walked outside the cabins no longer needed to travel between them normally. Then someone screamed and pointed toward the execution clearing beyond the homes. Every person turned at once. A woman stood there near the old gallows, pale dress, motionless posture, watching the settlement silently from the darkness. "Alse," someone whispered beside me. More people began crying after that. One man dropped to his knees in the mud while repeating prayers under his breath. But I kept staring at the figure near the clearing because something about it felt wrong in a different way than before. Colder, somehow, less human. Slowly, the woman near the gallows lifted one arm and pointed toward the crowd. Not at everyone, at one person, specifically, Ruth Miller. The moment that happened, Ruth started screaming again violently enough that several people lost hold of her. "She wants me next," she cried. "She says they'll believe it again." Panic tore through the settlement completely after that. People started backing away from Ruth immediately, like fear itself had become contagious. And standing there watching the crowd separate from her, I finally understood what Alse meant earlier. The haunting wasn't feeding on revenge. It was feeding on accusation. The moment I realized the haunting fed on accusation instead of revenge, the entire settlement suddenly made horrifying sense to me, because every strange thing that happened after Alse Young's execution had pushed the colony toward the exact same fear that killed her in the first place: the knocking, the sightings, the whispers outside cabins at night. None of it drove people together. It drove them toward suspicion, toward choosing another person to blame so the fear would have somewhere to go. Ruth Miller was still screaming near the crowd while people slowly backed away from her in the mud, not because they believed she had done anything wrong, but because fear had already started turning her into the next explanation. I remember looking around the settlement and realizing almost nobody was staring at the woman near the gallows anymore. They were staring at Ruth, exactly the same way they once stared at Alse. Then the figure near the execution clearing moved for the first time, slowly, calmly, walking toward the edge of the settlement while candlelight and lantern glow flickered across the muddy paths between homes. Nobody approached her. Nobody even spoke. The entire colony watched silently as she crossed the darkness beyond the cabins without making a sound. She stopped near the edge of the crowd and looked directly at me. Her expression no longer seemed confused or frightened like before. It looked exhausted. deeply exhausted. And when she spoke, only I seemed to hear the words clearly. They need someone to fear. A cold pressure moved through my chest because I knew she was right. The settlement had become trapped inside its own terror long before the execution. Killing her only gave the fear a face to wear afterward. Then, somewhere behind me, another voice shouted Ruth Miller's name accusingly. One accusation became two, then more, quiet at first, then stronger as frightened people repeated each other's suspicions through the crowd. Ruth's sobbing grew louder while people moved further away from her, and I suddenly understood what the haunting truly was. It wasn't Alse Young returning for revenge. It was the colony repeating the same sin over and over until fear itself became alive. I looked back toward the figure near the gallows one final time, but she had already started fading into the darkness surrounding the clearing, not disappearing violently, just becoming harder to separate from the night itself. And before she vanished completely, I heard her whisper something softly enough that I almost missed it. It never stops after the first one. The settlement changed permanently after that night. More accusations followed over the next months despite everything that happened. More fear, more whispers, more people watching each other through suspicion instead of trust. I left the colony before another execution could happen because I couldn't bear watching the town become consumed by the same cycle again. But even years later, I still remember the knocking. 3 slow knocks outside the cabin door shortly after midnight. Calm, patient, waiting. And sometimes, when I wake suddenly in the middle of the night, even now, I still feel the urge to stay completely silent in bed afterward, listening carefully to make sure there are no footsteps stopping outside my home. Because the most terrifying thing about Alse Young was never whether she truly returned after death. It was realizing fear alone can turn ordinary people into something far worse than ghosts. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to True Haunting Log so you never miss the next encounter. And if you've ever lived somewhere that felt poisoned by fear after something terrible happened, send your story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com and tell us in the comments, what other ghost topic do you want to hear real stories about next?